Hello and welcome to this speaking tutorial. In this video we're going to look at macro security in Microsoft Excel and how it relates to the Optimix appraisal toolkit. Specifically, we'll be covering the aspects of macro security that you need to be aware of in order to use Optimix as intended with macros enabled. First, we'll briefly look at what macros are and the kind of thing they're used for in Optimix. Then we'll take a look at macro security in general, as well as some of the basic settings that are available for managing it. After that, we'll move on to how you can make sure that macros are enabled when you open an Optimix file to work with it, and I'll walk you through a few ways to do this. Then we'll take a look at digital signatures, what they are, what they do, and how they relate to Optimix. And in the final section, I'll talk about what trusted publishers are in terms of macro security, and I'll show you how to add Beacon as a trusted publisher on your computer. Okay, let's get underway. Okay, so the first thing to say is that if you're already familiar with what macros are, then feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter on macro security. Or if you just want information on how to enable macros for Optimix, go ahead and skip straight to that section using the chapter list on the video. Now, many people who use Excel tend to focus on its use as a data storage and presentation tool for recording information in a grid or table layout like this. And often they might use it for doing some manipulation of that data using some of the built-in functionality in Excel, or by writing formulas to perform calculations on it. Then there's the ability to create things like charts and pivot tables for reports. And you can even put these all together to make entire dashboards. And for most Excel users, these features cover everything that they need it to do for them. But there's a programming language called Visual Basic for Applications, or VBA for short, which provides a way to automate and extend the native functionality of Microsoft Office. You can write code in VBA that will perform tasks according to whatever logic and workflows your specific needs dictate, and much more quickly and accurately than any person performing those same tasks manually would using the normal Excel user interface. And when people refer to macros, they're talking about sequences of this VBA code that are saved and embedded in Office files, which can be run to perform tasks when the file is open. Now, this video is not intended to be a VBA coding tutorial. There are plenty of videos on YouTube which are for that purpose if you want to know more. But here's a quick and simple example of the kind of thing that we use VBA macros for in Optimix, just so that you can get an idea of why we provide Optimix as a macro-enabled workbook. So on the welcome sheet in Optimix, we have various checkboxes and buttons which perform different functions when they're clicked by having VBA macro code associated with them. For example, if I click the email support button here on the left, a draft email is automatically generated in Outlook with a predefined support request template inserted into the body of the email. And here is some of the VBA code which facilitates that. Not all of it, we don't want to give away all of our trade secrets, but this gives us a way to obtain relevant information in a standardized format from users who need our help, and in a way that's hopefully easier for them, as they don't have to create the draft email, enter the email address and type all this out themselves. So VBA is quite a powerful programming language, and the things you can achieve with it are essentially limited only by your imagination and ingenuity. Beacon uses VBA in Optimix and our other toolkits to provide various automations and enhancements like this, with the aim of providing a user-friendly interface and a product that's convenient and efficient to use. But unfortunately, as with any programming language, there are those out there who would try to use VBA for malicious purposes. And this brings me nicely onto discussing the topic of macro security. So because VBA is such a versatile and powerful programming language, it can be used very effectively for all sorts of purposes, both beneficial and detrimental. Unfortunately, it's becoming all too common for creators of malware to try to trick or convince unsuspecting users into opening macro-enabled files and enabling macros as a way of delivering their payload of malicious code to your computer, often to infiltrate and compromise corporate networks and to obtain or hold to ransom sensitive or personal data. Now, this has been an issue for almost as long as scripting languages for Office applications have existed, but as time has gone by, Microsoft has added various tools and safeguards to Microsoft Office which give users an opportunity to control which files open with macros allowed to run, based on things like whether the file originated from somewhere or someone that they consider to be trustworthy, amongst other factors. And these measures are what we're talking about when we refer to macro security. And we'll have a look at some of the basic macro security settings in Excel now as they exist today. So in Excel, if you go to the File menu and then down to Options on the left hand side here, and then click into the Trust Center and then into Trust Center Settings and then Macro Settings, you'll see that there are these 4 macro security settings available. Now, if you chose this option, Enable VBA Macros, and I must emphasize, I strongly advise you against choosing that, but if you did, then this would allow VBA code to run by default in any macro-enabled file you received and then opened, regardless of where it came from. Now, this would leave you, and potentially your employer if you're on a work device, very vulnerable to things such as macro viruses, ransomware attacks and other malware. So obviously this is not what you want. Therefore, Office applications have these macro security settings which allow you to specify what the default behavior will be when a macro enabled file that has not been encountered before is opened. Now, Excel's default setting is to disable VBA macros with a notification. And just to demonstrate what this notification looks like, here's one I prepared earlier. And when we open this macro-enabled workbook, first we'll get this warning displayed in the message bar at the top to tell us that there are macros in the file, but they're currently disabled. And there's a button here that you can click if you trust the document enough to allow those macros to run. Now, as soon as I click that button, any VBA code that's set to run immediately when the file is opened kicks in. And in this case, that just happens to be a pop-up message, but obviously it could be doing anything. And that's why the trust aspect here is so important. Now, once you've indicated to Excel that you trust this specific file, and that's what you're doing by clicking the Enable Content button, Excel remembers that and records it as a trusted document. And then if we close and then reopen that same file, as we will now, Excel knows that it's a document you trusted before, so it doesn't prevent its macros from running. You see the pop-up message has appeared straight away without me having to click anything else. So this is one way of enabling macros when you open an Optimix file, but it does mean that you would have to do this extra step in every Optimix file that you open for the first time. And there are better ways that avoid this repetition and which don't make you deal with it on a file by file basis, and that's what we'll be looking at in the next section. In the previous section we saw how we can enable macros for one specific file from the first time we open it to every subsequent time we open it after that. Now, before we move on to ways to enable macros for more than one Optimix file at a time, there's something else you can do to speed up the process of getting to the stage of enabling macros, and it's something we can do before we open the file. So files that you download from the internet or that you receive as an email attachment and then save to your computer, they have a particular attribute attached to them called the mark of the web. This is done so that applications and the operating system know that the file originated from outside of your home or work network and can then treat it accordingly in terms of trust and security. Now, when Excel opens a file with this mark of the web on it, first it will open it in something called protected view, and you'll get this yellow notification in the message bar at the top. Now this is like a holding area, an isolated sandbox mode for Excel to run in terms of security, to restrict the effects of any malicious content there might be in the file. And you'd then have to click this enable editing button to go any further. But then after that, it also still disables any macros in the file, as we saw before, offering you the option to then enable content by clicking a second button to allow any VBA code in the file to run. However, there is a way to remove the mark of the web from a file that you've downloaded to your computer or saved from an email attachment, and that's what I'll show you next. So let's say we've just downloaded a macro enabled workbook from somewhere online, maybe a SharePoint document library or cloud storage solution. So it's in our downloads folder. Now in File Explorer, if we go to our downloads folder and then we right click on the file that we've downloaded and select properties, on the general tab here down at the bottom there's a note labeled security, and it's warning you that the file came from a different computer. And to all intents and purposes, this is the mark of the web. Now if you trust the file and you were expecting to receive this macro enabled file, as I hope that you trust Optimix files when you receive those, tick the unblock checkbox. And then what I like to do first is to click the apply button just to make sure that this unblock change has been made successfully, and then click OK, and then the properties dialog disappears. Now if I open that file, this time you skip straight past protected view, and then you've only got one button to click to enable macros, which is the enable content button we saw before. Now it's worth mentioning that email attachments, as I mentioned previously, also get this mark of the web attached to them. So if you've ever tried to open an Optimix file directly from an email that you've received in Outlook, then you'll know that it always opens in protected view first, as we saw before. Let's close both of those. But if you right click on the attachment and click Save As, and then save it somewhere first. So let's pop into the email attachments folder and save it in there. Then you can navigate to where you've just saved that and use the same unblock method that we saw before to remove the mark of the web, like this. And then when you open that file, it's going to skip straight past the protected view stage to the enable content stage, as we saw before. And one problem you might run into here is that some IT administrators configure user permissions in Windows such that the unblock checkbox is grayed out, meaning you can't do anything with it. And if that's the case for you, then this will be for security reasons, out of an abundance of caution when it comes to handling unfamiliar downloaded files. So you'll need to submit a request to your IT service providers to unblock the file for you. Now, when you use Optimix on a regular basis, you'll likely have some kind of folder structure set up somewhere to store your master appraisal template and the appraisal files that you've created for various schemes at different times. And these will usually be either on your local computer or in a shared location on the network somewhere, like a mapped drive or a SharePoint document library. And one of the things that you can do in the Trust Center in Office applications is define something called a trusted location. So if you go into File, as I just did, and then Options and Trust Center Settings again. But this time we're going to go to the Trusted Locations section here. You'll see that at least some will already be defined. Microsoft Office installations by default usually have these set up, although the paths to each one might be slightly different on your machine. Now, a trusted location is a folder whose contents Excel will trust by default in terms of macro security. So if you save a macro enabled file in one of these trusted locations, when you open it, Excel won't block macros from running or make you explicitly enable content by clicking that button. Macros will be enabled straight away. So assuming that you are a regular Optimix user, then for convenience it's probably a good idea to nominate a folder or a set of folders either on your local computer or somewhere within your network that you have access to, which you can set as a trusted location in Excel, which you should then save any Optimix files into before opening them. Now that way, any Optimix files you open from that location will have macros enabled without any additional steps every time. So to add a trusted location, click the Add New Location button and then click Browse and then find the folder that you want to nominate as your trusted location, and you can either left click to select it or double click into it before clicking OK, and this populates the path to that folder just here. Now before you click OK to create the trusted location, think about whether you want macro enabled files in subfolders of this location to also be trusted by Excel and open with macros enabled by default. And if the answer is yes, tick this checkbox here that says subfolders of this location are also trusted, and then click OK. And that's going to show up in the list. So that's been added to the user locations section up at the top here. Now, if I open a file saved in that folder, even though, as you'll see, if I go to the properties of the file, it still has the mark of the web attached to it. But when I open it, macros will be enabled without any security warning or additional buttons to click, because it's been opened from a trusted location. So before I move on to look at digital certificates, a couple of things to mention about trusted locations. Firstly, if the trusted location you're adding is not on your local computer, so it's on a shared location on your network or a map network drive or similar, then for this to work you will need to have this checkbox labelled Allow Trusted Locations on My Network to be ticked. The second thing to mention is corporate IT administrators often restrict or deny altogether permissions to create or modify some or all of these trusted location settings. So the controls for doing what I've just done might be disabled or greyed out for you. Or when you try to add a trusted location, you'll see a permission denied message or words to that effect. If so, you'll need to submit a request to your IT service providers to create or modify the trusted location for you. Now this method does the job for most Optimix users just fine, but it does come with the restriction that you'll only benefit from the convenience of always having macros enabled in Optimix if you're opening appraisal files from the specific location or set of locations that you've set up as a trusted location. Now also there's the risk that you might save a macro enabled file into your trusted location which isn't an Optimix file, and which therefore may or may not be as trustworthy, but it would still be opened with macros enabled. So that's something to be careful of. In the next section, I'll introduce the concept of code signing and digital certificates, as this is going to help you understand why adding Beacon Partnership as what is called a trusted publisher will provide you with the maximum amount of convenience when it comes to using Optimix. and the reassurance that only macro-enabled files that have come from us will open with macros enabled by default and with no prompt or buttons to click first. So you might be wondering how you can be sure that the VBA macro code in your organization's master Optimix template, or any appraisals you've used it to create, hasn't been altered in some subtle way, perhaps by somebody intercepting an email attachment in transit, or somebody who has access to your network or SharePoint library. Well, if that was the case, it might, or at least it should, change your perspective on whether you can safely trust the code in that file and allow macros to run. Well, firstly, we always password protect the VBA projects in our toolkits, which means that somebody trying to access the code via the Visual Basic editor is unable to unless they know the password, which we obviously keep secret. So just to demonstrate this quickly, with an Optimix template open here, if we go to the Developer tab on the ribbon in Excel and then click the Visual Basic button here, if I try to expand this hierarchical tree view of the Optimix VBA project by clicking this plus button over here in the Project Explorer, I'm prompted to enter a password. So that's one way in which we keep the code secure. But now you might be thinking, what if somebody guesses the password or runs some kind of brute force attack programmatically to discover it? And that's where digital signatures come in. Now, what follows will be a simplified explanation of digital signatures, and therefore it won't go into any of the technical detail on public key cryptography or encryption algorithms, which are the technologies which enable the digital signatures to do what they do. But in basic terms, if you sign the VBA code in a macro-enabled file using a digital signature, not only can the person receiving the file identify which person or organization the code came from, but also they will be warned if any changes have been made to the VBA project since that signature was applied to it. So in other words, if a micro-enabled file was intercepted by a malicious third party and they changed the code in it to do something nefarious, doing so would invalidate the digital signature previously applied to the file, and the user receiving it can detect this. So what I've just opened here is a password protected, digitally signed macro-enabled file. And when I open this up, if we click this message, macros have been disabled, it's actually a kind of link to the file info page of the file that's been opened. And if we then click the drop down on this enable content button with the shield icon and then click advanced options, we can see information about the digital signature, including that the digital signature used to apply it is valid and that it's not expired, as well as the name of the person or organization associated with the certificate. And we can then make an informed decision about whether we trust this organization as a source of VBA code. Now, imagine that this file is emailed to you by an external contact, but somehow the file is intercepted, the email is intercepted. Let's minimize that and open this up. So they open up the attachment and then they go into the VBA project, and somehow or other they manage to guess or work out the password protecting the VBA project. And they can now access the code to modify it, to make it do whatever they want. So I'll just make a small change here. But obviously this could be anything that they're adding or changing about the code. Now their intent will likely be to forward this altered file onto you as if it had been sent to you by your known contact, so that you're tricked into trusting it and allowing macros to run because you were expecting the file. But when they try to save their changes to the code, They're forced into either abandoning the changes or saving them but removing the digital signature, because they don't have the digital certificate we use to sign our VBA projects. So let's say they forge ahead and save the changes anyway, and then they send that on to us, making it look like your contact has sent that file. So here we have the altered version. Now when we open the file and we click the same macros have been disabled link that we saw earlier to drill down to the signature information via advanced options, there isn't any signature information. Well, we can no longer be certain that the VBA code in this macro enabled workbook is the unaltered version versus what our contact originally put in the file. It's an unsigned project and it might have been tampered with. So we're now in a position to query this with our contact directly before allowing macros to run. So that's essentially the principle behind digital signatures, but how does this help us in terms of macro security and convenience when it comes to using Optimix? In the final section, we'll answer that question by looking at trusted publishers. So now that we know where to find information on the digital signature applied to a macro-enabled file, what can we do with this information? Previously, we looked at how to set up a trusted location, a folder into which we could save and from which we could open our Optimix files, so that Excel automatically trusts the VBA code in those files and allows it to run. We also noted that this approach imposes a restriction on where you can keep your Optimix files, and a risk that any non-Optimix files saved to that location would also have macros enabled when they open. Now we can use digital signatures to our advantage here to eliminate such restrictions and risks. Beacon Partnership have obtained a digital certificate to sign our VBA code with, and from version 3.2.9 of Optimix, all your master templates will be issued to you with a digital signature applied. So having opened up a version 3.2.9 Optimix template here, let's have a look at the signature information in the same way we did earlier. Now you may have noticed in the previous section that there is a setting available here called Trust All Documents from this publisher. If I select that option and click OK, not only are macros then enabled in this file that we've just opened, but this has also added Beacon Partnership as a trusted publisher. And you can check this by going to the File Options menu and then Trust Center Settings, and this time Trusted Publishers. And there we are now in the list. So what this means is that any macro enabled files which have been digitally signed using the Beacon Partnership certificate will be trusted, and macros will be allowed to run regardless of where they're saved or opened from. I'll just show you that I've removed the trusted location that we created earlier to the VBA folder on the C drive so that I can demonstrate this in action. So that's gone from the list. Now when I open this file, which has been digitally signed with our certificate, whereas normally you would expect to have to explicitly enable macros by clicking a button, now the document is automatically trusted because it is recognized as having come from a trusted publisher. So this would be the case even if you downloaded the file or received it as an email attachment and it had the mark of the web on it. And the signature is also preserved when you use the normal Save As function in Excel to create a scheme-specific appraisal file to work with as a copy of your master template. Now, adding Beacon Partnership as a trusted publisher is the ideal way to use Optimix whilst also adopting best practice in terms of macro security, and in a way which makes using it as convenient for you as possible. without the additional clicks and steps to enable macros. Now, I ought to mention that, as we noted when discussing trusted locations, your IT administrators may configure user permissions to disallow adding trusted publishers in Microsoft Office applications. So if you don't see the option that we saw earlier to trust all documents from this publisher, or you encounter a permission denied message of some kind, get in touch with your IT service providers to ask them to add us as a trusted publisher for you. Now, if you've made it this far, well done for your stamina. I think that will about do it for this video. I hope this has been useful, and thanks for watching. We'll hopefully see you next time. Bye for now.